once you're able to thread your machine and you feel okay with some of the basic functions, maybe you've done your warm-up and done a bit of free stitching, you might like to practice stitching a row along one of these guidelines here. So each machine has guidelines along here, and that is to help you stitch a straight line, and they would be spaced out, if it's a metric sewing machine, about every 0.5, so half of a centimetre. The first one would be a guideline for a 1 centimetre stitch line, 1.5, 2 centimetre, and so on. So usually, most of the time when we're sewing things, we're sewing a seam, or what we call a seam allowance. We'd be deciding on what our seam allowance is. So a good width to start with would be 1.5 centimetres. So on this machine, that is the second line. If you're unsure on your machine what widths the lines are, if they don't have markings, you can put the needle down and place a measuring implement, like a measuring tape, up against it, and you can see that this line is 1.5, that first line is 1 centimetre. So that can help. So you want to sew 1.5 centimetres in here. That if you're making anything, a cushion or a piece of clothing, there's always what's called a seam allowance, your seam there, and the amount that's left on the inside is your seam allowance. So I'd recommend having slightly larger seam allowances when you're starting, just leaves room for error. So 1.5 is a good one to start on, which is our second line here. So the second practice I get people to do is get a nice, cut 2 nice straight bits of practice fabric, a nice length, have a decent length in it, and we're going to see how straight we can stitch. Line up the edge of this along the second line, which is 1.5. I'm using a black thread so that we can see it visually on the video. So I'm going to start stitching, then I'm maybe 2 or 3 stitches, and then I'm going to do my back stitch, and then I'm coming forward again. So that really knots it well, and you need to get in the habit of starting every stitch, every seam, every stitch line with a back stitch and ending it with a back stitch. So once we have that, we just continue to sew. So again, just a reminder that the sewing machine actually stitches straight, so you just want to be sure and guide the fabric to be in line with that. So your eyes are on this here, on this line, and getting this edge of the fabric to line up with that. Okay, and so you just stitch along. This hand is holding very lightly here. Sometimes when people are learning, they get really stressed out and they're holding and pulling and pushing and things. So try to relax your hand, and remember the machine actually stitches quite straight. If I don't do anything at all, it stitches actually fairly straight. So just hold gently and don't press down here, because it will start to stop the machine from doing what it needs to do. Okay, so my hand there is very light, and also here, so it's guiding very gently. And my hand is moving along, but it's not pushing or pulling. Okay, sometimes you might hold the fabric here at the back either, but again, it's very lightly held. So I'm going quite fast because I'm used to sewing, but you might like to go along at your pace. When you get to the end, a lot of times when people are starting, they're afraid of the edge of the fabric and they stop all the stitching before, but really you need to get in the habit of stitching right off the edge of your fabric. And so just go right the way off to the edge, and you can back stitch. So my needle is now off the edge of the fabric, and it's going to stitch back onto. So get as close as you possibly can to the edge, and even just stitching off the fabric's okay. You can back stitch back on. Okay, and that will knot the fabric, that back stitch, will knot the thread. So here we have a nice seam, nice and straight. That's our seam allowance there that I'm talking about, the 1.5. That would be on the inside of the garment, so we can open it up and we have a lovely seam. And on the inside, that would be like on the inside of our cushion or our garment, and that is 1.5 centimeters wide on each side. You can choose to have it be smaller or bigger. That's a kind of good average. So that would be your first official practice to do that. So for a second practice. Really, what we did there in the first one takes a bit of time to get down, sewing in a straight line in your back stitch and the lifting and all of that kind of stuff. So my suggestion is to do that about 5 times. If you have a lot of different lines on your machine, you can just go on the first one, second one, third one, and just to keep practicing. So my next practice is I'm going to go in to my next line, and again I'm going to start at the edge of the fabric, remembering to put that lever down so my presser foot is down. So do a few stitches, back stitch, and stitch away, keeping it straight. So you're practicing with your hands and getting them to cooperate and not pull and tug, and manage the fabric to go into a straight line. So I'm sewing quite quickly there just for demonstration purposes. Really, you probably want to start off sewing a bit slower, but I just want to get to the end, show you that as you get back to the end, you can, as well, if you can, go slower and get to the end, back stitch, come off. If there's anything you're ever worried about, you can also, for a few stitches, you can use that manual feed just to get yourself a few steps forward if you're finding it really hard to go slowly. Okay, so then lift up the lever there, pull your thread, got it. And so continue to do several more lines just to practice stitching straight lines, because almost anything you sew, that will be mainly what you're doing. You're mainly trying to stitch a straight line and keep the edge of your fabric lined up with one of these guidelines. So when you've done your 5 lines, you'll have something that looks like that, you know, just a lot of straight lines, all in a row, and your back stitches there and close to the edge. And so just give that a go and do your best you can. And it is very normal to find it a little bit challenging to get these straight lines, so don't be discouraged if you're starting out, but the more you practice, the better you'll get. So it's good to just try this and do these lines over and over to get your skills up.